This is Sports Jam, and I'm Doug Doyle, and my guest is one of the most recognized faces and voices in sports broadcasting history, a four-time Emmy winner and film producer. He's best known, though, for the blow-by-blow announcer on HBO World Championship Boxing for 30 years, a fixture on ABC and then on NBC Sports. He's covered all the major events, including the Super Bowl, Major League Baseball, college basketball, the USFL, believe it or not, and the Indy 500. And when you think of Jim Lampley, I think of the Olympic Games, too. He covered 14 Olympic Games, most recently the 2008 Summer Olympics in Beijing, China. Yes, Jim Lampley is our guest here on Sports Jam. Jim, thanks for joining us.
My privilege. Pleasure to be with you.
Jim was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 2015. He writes, hosts, and executive produces his own studio boxing shows, The Fight Game with Jim Lampley on HBO. But just recently, he is back ringside. It was announced that Jim will be the new lead play-by-play voice of Triller Fight Club and will begin his multi-fight deal with the historic June 19th Triller Fight Club card at Miami's Lone Depot Park. We talked about it during our last Sports Jam with Franchon Cruz Dezern. And now that's going to feature both the women's undisputed and men's undisputed world title fights for the first time. So, Jim, everybody knows you as the voice of boxing. And when it comes to boxing, why did you decide to go with Triller Fight Club now? And does it have anything to do with this upcoming card?
Well, I haven't called a fight for 2.5 years. And initially that had to do with HBO's removal from the boxing scene when AT&T purchased Time Warner, and their executives made clear that they weren't interested in pursuing boxing. At that point, I was without a microphone, and it took a while to sort out all of the business details relative to that. And then you had COVID, which affected everything and probably affected to some degree the personnel outlook of those streaming services who were doing boxing at the time. And in recent months, it began to become clear to me that an offer might be forthcoming for me to go back to calling fights. So at that point, my attitude became, all right, where is legitimacy? Where's a jumping off point and a platform where I can do something that is meaningful from the get-go? And Triller made this offer not too long ago. They were very decisive and clear in what they wanted to do. And what they wanted to do was to communicate legitimacy. That's really the key word. And the key element here, you've already mentioned the women's championship fight, which will unify titles in a division. But the main event attraction is Teofimo Lopez against George Kambosos. And Lopez defeated Vasily Lomachenko. I spent many years on HBO and The Fight Game helping to build and develop Lomachenko's reputation and validating him as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the sport. To see somebody so easily dismantle him was surprising, maybe even shocking. And you could see the natural skill and comfort and ring generalship and all that stuff that Teofimo Lopez brought to that particular enterprise. So when Triller came along and said, okay, we want to make you an offer and we really want to try to get you on board in time to call the main event involving Teofimo Lopez, I said, let's do it. I've been looking for a legitimate platform. Lopez is potentially not just a next big thing, but possibly the next big thing. And I'm ready to go. He's in a crowded division at 135 pounds. He could move up to 140 if he wins this fight and face Josh Taylor, who just unified the 140-pound division above him. And of course, looming in the picture is the possibility of a rematch with Lomachenko. All those things considered, I felt like I needed to take this chance.
You know, when you hear Jim Lampley talk, you know, he's best known, as I said, the blow-by-blow announcer on HBO World Championship Boxing for more than 3 decades. And you see, he's still in the game. He's still up to date with what's going on. And that's exciting. So when it comes to this, you know, this big fight, I know you're looking forward to it. But I want to take you back just a little bit if I could. I want to take you back to February 25th, 1964. You are 14 years old. What happened during that night?
So I was originally from Hendersonville, North Carolina, and probably the single narrative line I've most frequently uttered in my whole life is my father died when I was 5 years old. And after my father died, my mother very constructively and aggressively did everything she could to immerse me in the things that she knew my father would want to do with me and would want me to know about that. And one of the first things she did was to take me to someone else's house where she was going to a party, march me down a hallway and sit me down in front of a small television set and tell me, you're going to watch the Friday night fights. It's Sugar Ray Robinson against Bobo Olson. It's their second fight. This is the most important fighter in the world, Sugar Ray Robinson, and you're going to see his amazing skills. And whatever you don't know about boxing, Don Dunphy is going to tell you in the next hour and a half or so. So I got started watching boxing at age 6. And my mother's last time before she left the room was, you're doing this because if your father was still alive, this is what you and he would be doing together. So I became a boxing fan. And then eventually she moved us out of Hendersonville, North Carolina, and to Miami. And Cassius Clay was already my biggest hero in sports. There is a lot that goes into that. Some of that was my mother having a very strong chemical resistance to racism, and the fact that Cassius Clay was portraying an anti-racist stance very aggressively, more aggressively than any American athlete up to that point. That made him an ideal sort of central hero for me. And in 1963, I began to read in the Miami Herald and the Miami News that there was a possibility of a championship fight being created between Cassius Clay and Sonny Liston. And oh, by the way, if it took place, a likely venue was the Miami Beach Convention Center. So I began saving up car washing and lawn mowing money and did so for months to buy a ticket for that fight. One ticket. There's no way my mother and I could have afforded two, but I saved up enough money to buy one ticket, which in my memory was either $100 or $150. I don't know for sure because stupidly, I didn't save it. But I wasn't so stupid that I didn't know who was going to win the fight. And when Cassius Clay knocked Sonny Liston out, well, we drove back to our tract house community in Southwest Miami, and I got up on the roof and started yelling, "I've upset the world. I'm the greatest of all time," et cetera, until my mother eventually said, "Come back down. You don't want to get us all arrested here." And then 2 days later, Cassius Clay told a gaggle of reporters on a street corner in Miami that he was now a citizen of the Nation of Islam and his name was going to be Muhammad Ali. And I can't tell you how many months it took for me to digest and inculcate that. That was a very difficult transition for me, but eventually I learned that it wasn't my identity. No matter how big a fan I was, it was his identity. And so yes, and the connection here that you're already feeling, because I can tell you're really hip, is that on February 25, 1964, I watched as a live spectator the fight that was at that time indisputably called the biggest upset in the history of boxing. On February 10, 1990, in Tokyo, Japan, sitting at ringside for HBO at Buster Douglas's knockout win over Mike Tyson, I called the fight that succeeded that one as the biggest upset in boxing history. So there are large elements of my life, and that whole story is probably most central in establishing that there's a kind of a destiny at play here. I do the things that destiny has laid out for me to do. It isn't me doing that. It's some other force in the universe. And I've felt that in virtually everything that's ever happened to me in my sports commentary career.
Jim, that also shows what kind of love your mother had for you at that time, knowing that, without your dad, she was going to make sure that his presence was felt in your life early on.
Well, and it wasn't just the boxing, okay? It was Hendersonville high school football games on Friday nights against Brevard and Waynesville. It was the ability to go to Southwest Miami high school football games once we got to Miami by myself, without her needing to go in and chaperone me, not worried about me, et cetera, et cetera. It was stretching her budget to buy tickets in the upper deck, season tickets for University of Miami football games, so that I could go watch a quarterback named George Myra leading the Miami Hurricanes against named football teams. And oh, by the way, when I was chosen out of a 432 person national talent hunt to be the first college age reporter, the first person on the sidelines of college football with a camera and a microphone in 1974, the audition interview that got me that job was with George Myra, who was at that point in one of the ancillary football leagues. Maybe it was the AFL. I don't remember for sure. He was sort of on his last legs as a professional quarterback. They called me and started to try to tell me who George Myra was so that I could go interview him. And I said, no, you don't have to tell me. I have an idea who George Myra is. I was probably the only American football fan at that moment in August of 1974 who still had a number 10 University of Miami green, orange, and white George Myra jersey hanging in my closet. So again, destiny has played the central role, along with, as you very, very accurately point out, my mother, and the love she showed, the sacrifices she made, and the fidelity she showed to the notion of who my father would want me to be.
It's really a tremendous story. And then you think about, you've already referenced the fight in Tokyo in 1990. And isn't it something that most people say is your most famous call, is simple and direct, as you have said, and I'm going to have you repeat it, but it also holds true to today. It still is. What?
Well, I think there are two very famous calls, and we'll get to that. But yes, that night, and again, you've been watching for 9+ rounds. It's no accident what's happening in the fight. I say to people to this day, that was a style fight. That was about the fact that Buster Douglas was taller, longer, could bring the right hand over the top where the shorter fighter wouldn't necessarily see it. He had basketball type athletic skills. That whole combination was very difficult for Mike at that time. So you could see it coming. So I've had a little while there to think about, okay, how are we going to sum all this up? What am I going to say? And at the moment when Tyson went down and the count begins, and it's very clear that Mike's not going to get up, a voice in the back of my head says, simplest is best. Don't overreach. Don't try for too much. So the call is, Mike Tyson has been knocked out. No embellishment, no grandiose proclamation. Simply, Mike Tyson had been knocked out. And that worked because it was the last thing anyone had expected to see at that moment in that fight.
And also your voice, it just brings it home. You didn't embellish, but it's just your voice. There's something in your voice that provides truth and excitement to sports like, almost nobody else. And when you think about that, you say, it was let's go ahead, call it biggest upset in the history of heavyweight championship fights. It still is.
Well, I had sat there in the 9th round, one round before, thinking to myself, oh my God, the first live prize fight you ever went to was at that time the biggest upset in the history of boxing. And now you are calling the fight, which will dislodge it, as the biggest upset in the history of boxing. So I was already placing myself within that moment as we got to that point. And oh, by the way, with apology for stepping away just to fill out what I said before, the other very famous call is it happened. And that's George Foreman knocking out Michael Moorer in Las Vegas to become the oldest heavyweight champion in history, to regain the title that he had lost to Ali decades before, et cetera, et cetera. And that's another one that sort of came out of the blue. That was less planned than Mike Tyson has been knocked out, because I couldn't be sure that George was going to knock him out. But I had, and you've probably heard this story, you're very well versed, I had spent months at ringside with George, who was my expert commentator on HBO boxing telecasts, saying to him, George, how in the world are you going to deal with Moorer? He's a mover. Evander Holyfield couldn't find him in the ring. And Evander has much better feet than you do. This isn't really going to work very well for you. And George said to me over and over and over, very flatly, Jim, you watch. Somewhere in the late rounds, somewhere in the latter part of the fight, he's going to come and stand in front of me and let me knock him out. Never forget the words. Not be in position where I can knock him out. He's going to let me knock him out. And if you watch the video, I mean, it couldn't be more graphic. Moorer comes and stands in front of him and lets George knock him out. So I'm sitting there thinking, all right, why didn't you plan for this? Why, why didn't you dream up some meaningful line that is the perfect caption to this? Why didn't you believe your buddy is basically what I'm asking myself. And what comes out of my mouth is, it happened. It happened. And luckily, it sounds matter of fact. It sounds spontaneous, which it was. It's probably the single line I'm most proud of, along, of course, with Mike Tyson has been knocked out.
When you have that 45-year-old who you knew well, as you said, working with him in that 1994 fight, the George Foreman brand changed forever. The people's opinion of George Foreman, even though as a commentator, they started to change and started to love him, but he became one of the most beloved people after the big comeback. I mean, when he was at his best, he was considered the enemy at times, right?
Well, he was groomed early on by surly, alienated, antisocial people. Okay, Liston's camp, the people who had been around Sonny, some of the people who were dealing with racial prejudice and its outgrowths within boxing at that time, they gave George a certain kind of attitude that he used in the ring and out during his first career. And then when he went away from the sport for a long time, and he spent 10 years more or less in exile from it, I think somewhere in that period of time, he thought to himself, you know what, that wasn't me. That really was not who I want to be or who I want to be seen as. And he came back as the cheerful, hamburger selling, grinning, everybody's best friend kind of guy. And that personality reversal was in its way compelling and surprising to people. And then gradually he started to build his career toward this, inevitable title shot, because he's one of the most beloved people in the culture by this point. That smile is selling Meineke mufflers, it's selling hamburgers, it's all over popular culture, kind of the way Shaq is now, by the way. Shaq has inherited George's role within the culture, and more power to him. He's brilliant at it. But so George came back and changed his persona entirely and got ready for a fight that almost nobody thought he could win. But what I think people underestimated about George in his second career is that he was a scientist. He was totally into the craft and technique of boxing. I remember the night that he described to me how he had in his arsenal 5 different jabs. There was the setup jab. There was the knock you into next week telephone pole coming out of a window jab. There was a jab that looked like a hook, et cetera, et cetera. And he told me how he could use any one of those 5 jabs to set up the right hand or the uppercut when and if he wanted to. Well, I think most people, even sincere boxing fans, didn't realize that George was at that level of craft and analysis. I began to feel it sitting next to him at ringside. Sometimes he would say something totally counterintuitive, and I'm thinking, where in the world did that come from? But at the end of the day, he's an incredibly smart man. He knew what he was doing. George is on my list. By the way, I'm in academia now, teaching class at the University of North Carolina. George is still on my list as one of the 5 smartest people I've ever known. His level of wisdom and innate genius, particularly with relation to the craft and technique of boxing, is off the board, and it'll blow your mind.
You say, what classes Jim Lampley teaching at UNC Chapel Hill? Evolution of Storytelling in American Electronic News Media, which basically takes you from 1920 to 2020. And during the pandemic, I've heard you say it was the perfect time to have that class because your students were able to see it and live it as it changed.
It was almost as though the pandemic came along as an exhibit for my class to see how the construction of the story, the systematic delivery of the story, the way it lands with the audience, all of those things can be affected by institutional factors, personnel factors, on-air personality, et cetera, et cetera. And that's really what the class is all about. The class is about how do news stories originate and eventually get propagated, and what happens along the way to affect or change their content. Can be a business circumstance, can be a technological circumstance. Perfect example that I always point out on the first day of the class. How did I become the college age reporter on the sidelines of ABC Sports college football telecast? The irony of that is that it was 1972, ABC Sports was televising the Munich Olympics. 10 Israeli athletes were kidnapped and held hostage by Black September terrorists, and reporters like Howard Cosell and Peter Jennings were pushing the control room. How do we get closer? How can we get a better picture from that balcony outside the room where the hostages are being held? How can we get more detail with which to tell the story? And during that process, ABC engineering learned that radio frequency microphones and cameras would do things that they didn't know they would do. They learned that signals would go around concrete walls, that signals would go around metal barriers, that they could gather sound and pictures that they never dreamed they could get under extreme circumstances. They were learning that. So when they came back from Munich early in 1973, there was a meeting in New York among the sports executives, the news executives, and the engineering executives. And the question was, now that we know this, what can we do with it? And the first thing that came from that was, well, you could put a reporter on the sidelines of a football game. And institutionally, you couldn't have done that with the NFL at that time. The NFL ran its own game in a certain way, and you weren't going to be able to do that. But oh, by the way, it made more sense where at college football, where all of the pageantry and the surrounding stuff and the cheerleaders and the marching band and all those things played a role. So it was more fitting to have somebody on the sidelines there. And even then there was pushback. Sports writers didn't like it. Some of the sports information directors got together to push back at it. But it just happened that the chairman of the Coaches Association was Bear Bryant. And I met him pretty early on in the process. And when the subject came up in a coaches meeting, how do we get rid of this? Brian said, no, we're not going to get rid of it. I like it. And that was pretty much the end of that. So, another lucky break, another purely circumstantial element that went into my evolution, but it helps to create my perspective for teaching Communications 490 at the University of North Carolina.
You caught that title, right? Yeah, there you go. And I see a masterclass somewhere down the line from you on that as well. It was back in 1974 that while in graduate school, I guess you could call it almost America's Got Talent. You could call it The Voice. You could call it American Idol. A talent search for ABC came about, and they saw this very good-looking young guy who could be somebody that people could relate to. And that person was Jim Lampley. And boy, you didn't disappoint, did you, Jim?
Well, I'm happy to hear you say that. And, I did wind up working at ABC Sports for 13 years off of that particular platform. But at the beginning, I was screened out of the process. I mean, I was screened out very early on from among the 432 candidates because they wanted somebody 18 to 22, and I was already 25. They wanted somebody who was in undergraduate school, and I was already in graduate school. They wanted somebody who had done no broadcasting whatsoever, who was completely fresh and unformed with regard to that. And I had done pregame and postgame coaches shows and various other things of that nature with Dean Smith and Bill Dooley here in Chapel Hill. So in a variety of different ways, I didn't fit the profile of what they wanted to do. And then spring turned to summer and fall was approaching, and they were getting into position to try to make a choice. And Roone Arledge wound up being a little bit discomfited with the notion of putting somebody on the air on a network telecast who had never had any broadcasting experience whatsoever. And he asked the staff people who were involved in this, did you talk to anybody who's actually been in front of a microphone? And they said, yeah, actually we did talk to one guy who has been in front of a microphone. And by the way, a lot of things have happened and you're about to hire him to go to work in program planning, which is what I wanted to do.
Wow.
I was headed for the network to work learning how to negotiate for and buy the rights to the crazy wide world of sports events that I wound up covering 2 or 3 years later. And I was really excited about that because that was where all my graduate school courses were leading. I was taking graduate school courses in business and organizational elements because the guy who ran the radio station in Chapel Hill had said to me the year before, Jim, you're really good at all this on-air stuff. And I can tell that you really like all this on-air stuff that you're doing. But I do want to warn you, if you get totally infatuated with being on the air, you could wind up at age 46 carrying equipment in New Bern. Well, I had seen New Bern during a political campaign. 46 sounded ancient to me. I kind of switched my profile and made all my graduate school courses about business and organization. So I was perfectly set up to be the program planning guy. And at the last minute, August 8th, they called me up on the phone and said, well, we're kind of looking at a different scenario here. Can you go do this audition interview with a guy named George Myra? And I'm thinking to myself, they couldn't find anybody else in the country who knows more about George Myra. I mean, this is supposed to happen. So I went down to Birmingham and I did the interview with George Myra. And, at the end of the day, they chose me for that. But the network and I were both headed in an entirely different direction until less than a month before the first game.
Did Roone and you ever have a conversation later on about that time period? And you certainly weren't carrying equipment. You were leading the show by the time you were at ABC.
I was the second or third face that you saw on the air when the show came on the air.
With other legendary, and please talk about the other legendary people you've worked with.
Well, that was the first year that Keith Jackson was the A-game primary play-by-play commentator, replacing Chris Schenkel, who had been the A-game commentator for years and years and years before him. They owed something to Keith Jackson, the network did, because you may recall that in the first year of Monday Night Football, 1971, Keith was in that booth with Don Meredith and Howard Cosell. And Arledge had made a difficult decision that personality match wasn't nearly as good as if they put Frank Gifford in that play-by-play position. So here we are 2.5, 3 years later, and Keith is still burning inside with his resentment about having been taken off of Monday Night Football, and justifiably so. He was a far more skilled play-by-play man than Frank Gifford. I love them both, but there was a difference. So at the end of the day now, Roone realizes CBS is coming after Keith. He needs to incentivize Keith to stay at ABC, and Schenkel has had decades in the sun, so to speak. And Roone takes Keith Jackson to dinner and says, all right, I'm going to give you what you want. You will become the A-game voice on college football. So it was Keith and Bud Wilkinson in the booth. I mean, my mother was a huge admirer of Bud Wilkinson. I'd heard about him every college football season of my life. There was another sideline guy that first year whose name was Don Tollefson. He was the candidate whom the staff people had focused on from the very beginning of the process. They knew they were going to hire Don Tollefson, and Roone at the end of the day had said, well, can't we have two? And that way, later in the season, we can split them up and send them to separate games. And that's ultimately what wound up happening. And of course, the idea was that there would be a different one every year. And so at the end of the first season, Don and I would go off and do something else, and then somebody else would come in and be the college age reporter. And at that point, I still thought I was going to get the program planning job. And they had told me in January, you can go sit in a cubicle and listen to two executives named John Martin and Jim Spence as they school you in how to buy these rights and stuff like that. And I wound up going to the National Football Foundation Hall of Fame dinner at the Waldorf Astoria in early December. And I looked across our table, the ABC Sports table, and I saw a guy whom I had known from his law school experience here in Chapel Hill, a guy named Bob Greenway. And I'm sitting there thinking, what is Bob Greenway doing here? I don't know of any attachment between him and ABC Sports. And eventually, as the evening went on, I walked around the table, tapped him on the shoulder. We had a big reunion. He got up and hugged me, et cetera, et cetera. I said, why are you sitting at our table? He said, well, I've got a great job. I'm coming to work in January with John Martin and Jim Spence to work in program planning. And I spent the whole night, I mean, steaming, not sleeping, driving myself crazy in the Warwick Hotel across the street from ABC on 6th Avenue. And finally, I went to the office of Chuck Howard, Senior Vice President of Production, producer of the college football telecast. And I started raging and yelling, you guys have betrayed me. You've given my job away, et cetera, et cetera. And Chuck said, Jim, calm down. Did you really think that you were going to fly around the country first class all fall, go into college bars and be recognized in every college town in America, have people yell your name from the stands so that you can wave back and say hello to them and stuff like that? Did you really think after all that you were going to come sit in a cubicle for $1,500 a month, taking paperwork instructions from John Martin and Jim Spence? So get a hold of yourself. You are going to have a career here. I'm going to start assigning you to Wide World of Sports shows within the next month or two. You're going to do another season of college football next fall. You're going to go to the Winter Olympics in Innsbruck next year as a feature reporter. Calm down. And I did. And all of those things happened. So eventually they started keeping their promises to me, which was good. And as for Roone, that's the other great part of it. They interviewed 432 people for the college football reporter position. They didn't bother to recognize that I was from Hendersonville, North Carolina. Roone's parents lived in Hendersonville, North Carolina. My mother was in his mother's bridge club. I had caddied for his father at the Hendersonville Country Club. So, I kept this under my hat. I never said a word to any of them. It wasn't until I was in New York a week and a half before the first telecast, learning how to use an air travel card and fill out an expense report, that I ran into the guy who was teaching me how to fill out the expense report. Said, there are a lot of people here who haven't met Roone Arledge. When you meet him, they'll probably be in the restroom. I went upstairs before leaving the building to get my bag and went into the men's room, and there he was. And so I met Roone Arledge just exactly the way Bob Apter told me I would meet him. And as we were washing our hands and getting ready to leave the men's room, I looked at him. I said, "So, how's your dad?" And he gave me this, like floored, curious expression and said, "Why would you ask me something like that?" I said, "Well, I guess nobody told you, but I'm from Hendersonville, North Carolina, and I used to caddy for your dad up at the golf course." And the famous red face turned white. And he said, "Don't ever tell anybody that. Don't ever, ever, ever tell a single soul, particularly anybody related to college football or a writer, that truth. We keep that to ourselves." Now the story can be told.
Wow.
They accidentally hired a guy who had caddied for Roone Arledge's father.
That's unbelievable. And
Yes.
and it was told in the bathroom too. So at that time, even today's world, maybe it wouldn't have been captured. Somebody would have captured them on their watch. Or on...
It's like a movie scene. Okay. I mean, Bob Apter had told me downstairs, there are people who've worked here for years and haven't met Roone Arledge. When you meet him, you'll meet him in the restroom. I got on the elevator to go from the 16th to the 28th floor to gather my bag from a woman named Phyllis Colonna, who sat at the front desk. I said, "Let me use the men's room before I go." And there he was.
And do we know why he was always in the restroom?
Well, I didn't say he was always there. He just happened to be there at that particular moment. I don't think he was always there. I think this is just yet another element of the chain of destiny that we've established earlier on in the interview. Something was going to happen to me regardless of what obstacles might be perceived. And that was yet another part of the chain.
Not only can we remember Jim Lampley's voice in college, football, or whether it be in the boxing ring, courtside or wherever, and you can still hear Keith Jackson, "Oh, Nelly, Oklahoma and Texas." You just can't forget that. He was the greatest college football announcer when it comes to play-by-play, in my opinion. So it was a great move by ABC, and you got to work with him. And now you're the legend, Jim Lampley, that we're talking to here on Sports Jam. I want to talk to you a little bit about, since we're here in the New York, New Jersey area, people remember when WFAN started, you were the first host. What do you think about those days?
Well, that was yet another amazing coincidence in my life, because it was 1987, and Arledge had been moved out of leadership of the sports division by a new owner at ABC. ABC had been sold to a company called Capital Cities Broadcasting. Capital Cities was a stations group. They put a guy named Dennis Swanson in charge of the sports division. Dennis Swanson arrived at ABC Sports with one basic predilection, which was, who is Jim Lampley and how do I get rid of him? Why are we paying him all this money? So he wanted me out. The first thing he did to try to get rid of me was to assign me to an open place at ABC, which was ringside at the boxing matches. There was nobody who had inherited from Cosell the role of being the boxing blow-by-blow guy. And I surmise that Dennis Swanson's conclusion was, if I put Lampley in this position, he'll be allergic to the sport. The sport will be allergic to him. It'll be embarrassing to him because he's not Cosell. This is a great way to force Jim Lampley to leave the network. So I'm now a member of the International Boxing Hall of Fame, and I owe that to an executive who assigned me to boxing in an attempt to get rid of me. At the same moment, I had done some talk radio here and there, but I didn't have a particular post. And a guy named Jeff Smulyan, brilliant radio executive from Indianapolis, had decided that he wanted to pioneer the idea of a 24-hour-a-day sports talk radio format. So he bought an existing signal in New York and set it up as WFAN, the first 24-hour-a-day sports talk radio station. And he wanted a name broadcaster to take over leadership in terms of one of the time slots. I didn't want the early morning time slot. Ultimately, Don Imus wound up occupying that slot over a period of time. But I took 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. and 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. happened to be the time slot within which the signal came on the air. So I was the first talk show host ever on a 24-hour-a-day sports talk radio station. And the concept sounded so extreme at the time that I wrote about a 5-minute manifesto to read when I came on the air, describing what was going to happen here. And it was full of absurdities, okay? Like, callers will create trades, and callers will sell franchises, and guests will insult famous athletes in such a way that feuds will begin. I made all of this stuff up, and it was meant to be reductio ad absurdum. And of course, everything happened. All the things that I suggested within this absurd manifesto would happen, did happen eventually as the result of sports talk radio. In fact, I remember even saying there'll be 3 or 4 of these stations in the Salt Lake market talking about the Jazz 24 hours a day. That happened. So yes, I spent several months. Now, I went on the air July 1. July 2, I went into Swanson's office and surrendered my contract at ABC Sports. So I was hired partially because of my profile at ABC Sports. And by 24 hours after I did the first show, I no longer had that profile at ABC Sports. But Smulyan didn't mind about that. He liked what I had done the first day, so I stayed on the air at WFAN. Then I wound up going to the West Coast to work for CBS at KCBS TV and working for CBS Sports. And I continued doing the New York radio show, which we now called the Hollywood Satellite Show. I had a producer who would come in every morning and send me the New York Daily News and New York Post and even New York Times write-ups on the preceding night's hockey games, basketball games, whatever had happened so that I could sound current to the New York audience talking about New York sports. But of course, the idea was to talk about the entire sports world. My favorite thing that I did early on that first year, US Open tennis is coming up at Flushing. And I told my producer, a guy named Russ Mollahan, I said, Russ, get me a star tennis player for tomorrow morning. So I get up the following morning and he has sent me a message on the phone, and it says that we've got the number 22 ranked tennis player in the world, Michael Pernfors. And I'm like, number 22? I wanted Stefan Edberg. What are we talking about here? So I went on the air and totally destroyed Russ Mollahan for the whole first half hour of the show. Over and over, Russ, in his brilliance as a producer, has acquired for us the number 22 tennis player in the world. We don't know what the first 21 were doing, and I would speculate on what some of the higher ranked guys were doing, what the 11th ranked guy might be doing, what the 14th ranked guy might be doing. And of course, Pernfors was from Sweden. When he came on the air, I mentioned that he was from Sweden, and I pointed out that he played tennis at the University of Georgia. And I asked him, can you teach us how to play "How About Them Dogs," or how to say "How About Them Dogs" in Swedish? And he did. And so that became a daily slogan on the show. Callers would call in and say, because everybody wanted to be able to say "How About Them Dogs" in Swedish. And Pernfors became the official tennis player of the show. And he was on over and over and over. So sports talk radio, every show has a life of its own, a culture of its own. Things go in various different directions. People ask me, why is Jim Rome so successful? And I said, Jim Rome has an amazing ear. He hears and understands what exists in the culture at large that he can pull in and make a part of his show. And he made a great deal of money and fan base off of that for years and years and years. And I'm sure you do it too.
So I have you to blame when I hear people calling up and saying, yeah, I think we can get Mike Trout. Let's give our third and fourth worst pitchers in the minors, and I think they'll go for Mike Trout. Those crazy trades, it started with you, Jim. I have you to blame for that.
Well, I don't. I think you have the callers to blame for that, but I encouraged them. I certainly told them that was an available opportunity for them, and they do it. Yes.
You talked about writing out your manifesto kind of thing there, and when it comes to you've done some amazing work with voicing documentaries like The Marathon and things like that. What is it about this voice that has become iconic? And who gets the credit for shaping that voice? Was it just there all along for Jim Lampley?
I love you desperately for saying that my voice is iconic. I don't think of it that way.
I do.
Well, thank you. It's very kind of you. I've never thought of my voice as a huge asset in my career, but a lot of people do share your point of view. And, pretty frequently, somebody will tap me on the shoulder in the vegetable department at Whole Foods and say, I just love to hear your voice. I mean, will you please say something to me? That, stuff like that. So I think if there's anything there, it is that my mother, going back to the formative influence of my life, was a stickler for grammar and diction. She spoke the language correctly, and she wanted me to speak the language correctly. And she wanted me to have a big, flexible vocabulary. And she wanted me to be disciplined about the way that I used it. And sometimes I drive my own children and grandchildren crazy, correcting syntax and things like that here and there. But I do think there's a value to being right and to observing all the rules in the way that we use the English language. And to this day, I try to be as careful as I can about that. And beyond that, the rest of it is just, whatever the universe gave me in terms of physical wherewithal. I remember hearing my calls of high school football games at WCHL radio in Chapel Hill on tape, Chapel Hill versus Oxford or Chapel Hill versus Henderson in football, and thinking, oh my God, I sound like an 11-year-old kid. I sound terrible. Who would want to listen to that? But other people were saying, oh my God, you're great. That's really good. So you're never going to hear exactly what you want to hear in your own voice, but I'm pleased with how well I've done with what my mother taught me to do.
And truly has been an unbelievable career. Before we let you go, I did want you to have a chance to talk about Atticus Entertainment that you founded, and the other side of Jim Lampley behind, with the camera, behind the talent scene.
Well, I think of myself as a storyteller, and the influence that we have not touched on up to this point is that my mother and my paternal grandmother, my father's mother, both centralized me in their lives, and they competed for my affection and attention. And the biggest way in which they competed was storytelling. Both of them were inveterate, nonstop storytellers, and they were both great at it. They could have been Pat Conroy. They could have written Southern novels, both of them. And my grandmother in particular could tell the same stories over and over and over and change a detail or changed a word or changed an observation here and there and reinvent it. And you would always want to listen because she was so good at telling those stories. And my mother used her storytelling capacity to constantly connect me back to my father, and also to compete with Grandma Mid's view of the family. My grandmother had one view of the family, my mother had another view of the family. Storytelling was the way that they sort of went at each other in that regard. So it's naturally in me. It's an inherited trait to love telling stories. Sometimes my wife will say, get to the point. And I'll think, no, every detail is important. We have to touch every little rock in the stream along the way, or else the story isn't the same. And by the way, the listeners always side with me instead of my wife, but she's heard them too many times. So I was living in Hollywood. I had done lots of things in broadcasting. I was socializing and playing golf with movie stars and movie producers and writers and people of that nature in Hollywood. And I started thinking, okay, I belong in this world. And several people, various people, substantive people had said to me, you need to have a production company. You need to be in a position to take all the stories and the ones that you learn and activate them as projects. So I did. And of course, it's the most difficult and frustrating thing in the world. But I did get some things done along the way. I produced feature-length documentaries. I produced one mock doc feature film, of which I'm very proud. And on and on. It's gone on intermittently, and all of those careers are intermittent. The very great Bernie Brillstein, founder of the famous Brillstein Gray agency, once told me, he said, Jim, life as a Hollywood producer is a daily process of agony and regret, only occasionally interrupted by very temporary success. And he's right. That's pretty much what being a producer is all about.
Short quiz, and I promise short. Best Olympic event you ever covered?
Well, obviously, Al Michaels and Ken Dryden called the game. But I was sent to the United States hockey victory over the Soviet Union, February 22, 1980, to recruit and perform an on-air interview that would button up our telecast later that night, because as you know, and some people don't know, the game was played at 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon. Network was not on the air at that time. Millions of Americans still believe to this day that they watched it live that night. They didn't. They watched a videotape replay. Arledge, at the moment when the game was tied 2-2 at the end of the first period, had called me in an edit bay and said, what are you doing? I told him. He said, drop that, get over to the hockey arena and get inside to do an interview. And the last thing I said to him before he hung up the phone was, Roone, I don't have the right credential. And he said, you'll get in, clunk. So I went over to the arena, and I did get in, and I watched the last two periods from a camera platform, And I went downstairs thinking, all right, how do I get Mike Eruzione to do an interview with me? And he was the last player out of the dressing room. We happened to have the same agent. I yelled at him amid the crazy cacophony of that scene. He turned around, he recognized my voice, wound up finishing his dinner with him that night and interviewing him on the street. But the bottom line is, I saw live what I still believe is the greatest sports event in American history. And eventually I was part of it. And over the years since then, many times I have run into Mike Eruzione and Jimmy Craig at Olympic occasions and other occasions. And every time I'll lean over to say to Mike, because he's shorter than me, I'll lean over and say to Mike, you know, through the miracle of videotape, you are now the leading goal scorer in the history of hockey. And Mike every time says, Lamps, keeps going in, doesn't it? And yes, it keeps going in, and it's still a miracle.
Second question is, you said Lamps. Who calls you James Lampley instead of Jim?
Who calls me James? My wife does sometimes.
Is that affectionate or is that in trouble?
Oh, no, that's affectionate. Yeah, that's absolutely affectionate. She knows that I prefer it. There aren't many people who know that I would really prefer to be called James, but you know, those few who understand it, that's good. Emmanuel Stewart learned to call me James, just as I learned to call him Emmanuel. Everybody in the world who's being familiar and loving with Emmanuel would call him Manny. That wasn't really his preference. He made clear to me that he preferred to be Emmanuel. And by the way, he's the closest adult male friend I've ever had. I don't know who you might be referring to there. The answer is that there are some, but mostly they are people very, very close to me.
I was just curious because it's James Lampley, you know, they're on the screen with you. And it's like, okay, that means something to you. So, you know, so a lot of times I'll have Douglas and only people will hear me say Doug, and Mom is the only one who calls me Douglas. And the final question may be a little bit difficult for you to answer. You were only 5 when you lost your dad, you talked about. But if you had a chance to sit down with Dad now, what would you like to ask Dad or talk to him about?
I'm chewing my gum here to fight off tears. I said back to you at the beginning that the single narrative storytelling line I've used most in my whole life is my father died when I was 5 years old. And I think at the end of the day, if I could talk to him now, I would thank him for being a hero to me. You know, I'm father to 4 children and stepfather to others. And I know all of the difficulties and the pitfalls of parenting. When your father dies when you're 5 years old, you've been given an ironic gift, which is that I never had an argument with him. I never had a fight with him. I never had differences with him over anything, politics, society, relationships, nothing of that exists in my life. To me, he is an absolutely unimpeachable, iconic hero, a war hero, a decorated war hero, club champion at the golf course record holder at the golf course, owner of a car dealership in Hendersonville. He's all those things to me, and there is nothing negative in it. So I think at the end of the day, I would just say to him, thanks for giving me an identity that I was proud of. I am his namesake. He was James Bratton Lampley. I'm James Clifford Lampley. And thanks for remaining in my mind the way you have all these years, because I never, ever cover a sports event or do a sports story without thinking of him and of his devotion to those subjects.
I had a much different experience. I lost my dad at the age of 90 in May of 2020, but he's the reason I do what I do. So I can relate, James, to what you're talking about there. So the final question in the quiz is that you've done so much, you know, with HBO for all those years, HBO World Championship Boxing. The day that you heard it was over, were there tears?
Yeah. HBO is very important to me. I worked for virtually every commercial network that you can name. I worked for ABC, NBC, CBS, Turner, and I had many deep experiences in commercial television. Somewhere along the way, particularly once I started calling boxing matches, and once it was clear that the institutional nature of boxing was that it was headed toward being a premium pay cable sport, that HBO and Showtime were going to dominate that, I knew that at some point I would want to be sitting ringside for one of those two entities. Interestingly, the first fight I called outside of ABC Sports was for Showtime. I called a doubleheader involving Evander Holyfield in Saint-Tropez, on the beach in Saint-Tropez. It's the only boxing telecast ever with live nudity. And I, that might have made it look like I was headed toward working at Showtime. Pretty shortly after that, I signed a contract with HBO and wound up spending more than 30 years calling fights and Wimbledon tennis, by the way, at HBO. I did 12 years of Wimbledon tennis when those telecasts were 5 or 6 hours a day, no commercial. And my expert commentators were Arthur Ashe, Billie Jean King, Martina Navratilova, some of the greatest people in the history of the sport sat with me and called those tennis matches. So that is just as revered an experience for me and as fundamental an experience for me as was calling the fights. And there's a difference when you can say whatever you want to say on Saturday night or on Tuesday afternoon at Wimbledon, and you know for sure that regardless of whether it's controversial or negative or disputable or whatever, nobody at Dancer Fitzgerald Sample who represents Chevrolet is going to be picking up a phone to call your boss to complain about what you did on the air. That was never going to happen at HBO. And I had had that experience elsewhere. So it was always thrilling to me to know that the content was between me and the network. That was it. And no other outside party would participate in adjudicating whether that was right or that was wrong. And then you put together the people for whom I worked at HBO Sports, Seth Abraham, Ross Greenberg, ultimately the very great Richard Plepler, the greatest television executive I've ever known. That was just an incomparable familial experience for me. And I can only hope that as I continue forward in the boxing world, that I'll feel the same love and reverence for the people who pay me to call fights now that I did for decades for HBO.
And as we've been doing this interview, it's been going through my mind, Jim or James, whatever you prefer, but I'll go with James right now, is that those simple calls that we remember, for you, it was Mike Tyson's been knocked out, right? When I think of Al Michaels, do you believe in miracles? Yes. When I think of Howard Cosell, down goes Frazier. Very simple, but we remember them forever. And there's probably going to be another fight coming up on Triller Fight Club that we will remember James Lampley saying, oh, I remember back in 2021 in his return to boxing that he had this amazing call. As we leave this Sports Jam, what do you want to tell us more about your return to the ring?
That I'll be looking to be understated, just as you're talking about there, that I'll be looking to continue to remember that the picture is preeminent, that many times the picture tells the story in such a graphic and emotionally indelible way that you can't enhance it with something that you say. And I'll remember that the great underlying satisfaction of this business is to tell the truth. And when you can see the truth and tell the truth, you've done everything you possibly can to help the audience appreciate, enjoy, and understand the sports event. But ultimately, you're just a conduit. It's between them and the event. I'll always try to remember that.
One thing I want to happen after this show is Spike Doyle to come up to James Lampley, your father, and we know at a better place, and they shake hands and say, well done. You've done
happening right now. Happening right now.
I certainly hope so.
I have a huge belief in the connectivity of the universe, and you could not have experienced all the things that I have experienced without that being the case. there's a destiny. There's a plan somewhere. Me sitting at ringside to call Tyson Douglas. Who else among us was still around from having been at the Miami Beach Convention Center on February 25, 1964? The universe saw to that.
There is a reason why he was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 2015, four-time Emmy winner, film producer, and one of the legendary voices, ABC Sports, HBO, NBC, Showtime. It doesn't matter where he's at, but now he's at Triller, and the Triller Fight Club is where he's going to begin his multi-fight deal with the historic June 19th Triller Fight Club card at Miami's Lone Depot Park, which will feature both the men's and women's undisputed world title fights for the first time. What an honor and privilege it has been to have James Lampley on SportsJam.
By the way, Mr. Doyle, I'm sure you've already observed this in your head. The very first live prize fight I ever attended was in Miami. My comeback on Triller is in Miami.
The legacy continues. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
My privilege.